Hello and welcome to Billy's Craft Room. This tutorial is part of my online workshop series, Adventures in Acrylics. For more information about this, please visit the blog. In today's film, I'd like to show you a few different ways to apply gesso. I mainly use gesso on sketchbook pages to make them a little bit firmer for mixed media techniques, but I also find it useful to use on matte board to prepare the surface for acrylic paint. For this project you'll need Daler-Rowney white gesso. A palette knife, I find these flat ones most useful. A piece of scrap sponge. A jar of water and some rag for easy clean-up. And the first surface I'm using is mount board. It's a nice substantial surface and takes the gesso well. Let's start by using the palette knife. Pick up a generous amount of gesso onto the knife and apply it to the mount board as if you're buttering bread. I find it's easy to get a smooth application if you start off with a reasonable amount of gesso and smooth it into place. Gesso does take quite a while to dry completely, so it's much easier if you apply a thin layer and let that dry completely before you apply a second layer. Wipe off any excess gesso that's still wet back into the pot. You want to put the knife straight into water if you can't clean it immediately, because you don't want the gesso to dry on the tools. If you still find there's more texture on the gesso than you'd like once all the layers have dried, you can gently sand it for a smoother finish. Another way to apply gesso is using a piece of sponge. Pick up a generous amount of gesso onto the sponge and then swipe it across the board. Make sure you put the lid back on the tub. I tend to put a small amount of gesso out on a little dish when I do this, so I don't leave the pot open too long. Swipe the sponge across the board and it gives a nice even coating of the gesso. It's a good way to apply a thin coat of gesso. Allow that layer to dry, and then once it's dried, give it another layer, possibly in the opposite direction. If you want to add a texture to the board, allow the gesso to dry slightly and then drag the sponge across the surface. This introduces more texture to the piece, so you have quite a bit of control over how smooth or textured your finished piece will become. I find this most useful for gessoing intricate or awkward shapes as well. If you prefer, you can also gesso a board using a brush. Dip into the gesso as if it were paint and paint first in one direction, allow the layer to dry, and then paint in the other direction. As before, if you find you have more texture on the piece than you'd like, once all the layers have dried, take a piece of sandpaper and sand it back until it becomes smooth. To clean your tools, simply rinse them out under cold water and dry them on a rag. For brushes, also wipe them over a bar of soap and rinse thoroughly afterwards. It took me ages to try gesso for the first time, but now that I have, I'm really enjoying using it. Join me later in the series where I'll be sharing more techniques and effects using gesso. See you next time for more adventures in acrylics. For more inspiration, please visit the blog on www.billiescraftroom.co.uk.